Can you hear me out there? Never sure if this is working or not. Hello? Can you hear me out there? Okay, good. People can hear me. Great. Well, I guess we'll wait and see how many people we get here. I don't typically do a Tuesday live stream, but I was going to do a video, and instead I realized the video would probably be too long for what I wanted to talk about. So I decided to do a live stream instead. And then I tried to see if what's his name? DM Bloodworth, if he wanted to come on board, because he had just recently done a very good video about Baptism of Fire. But unfortunately he couldn't make it because he's gaming tonight. It's kind of weird who games on it. Well, I'm sure a lot of people game on a Tuesday. I tend to have to game on weekends more than anything. So we'll wait a little bit here while I'm cleaning these pipes to see if we get a bit more people. There also might be some people still recovering from VengerCon, who knows? Hello, Mac. Good to hear you game on Wednesday. It's good to game at least at any time, you know, but better than the alternative of not gaming. Wednesday, I have a standing appointment usually to go to the house of the guy who plays Bill the Elf and who also runs the Bill the Elf YouTube channel that has the audios of all of our DCC Last Sun campaign. So that usually means that I miss out on Diversity and Dragons live stream because he does it every Wednesday. Last week, Bill had to go to the dentist on Wednesday. I wasn't sure if he was going to be up to dining after that. So I ended up going to his place on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, I went to the Diversity and Dragons live stream, and I should have probably just left as soon as I saw that it was Black Lodge Games that was there, right? But I didn't, and so I spent most of the time fighting with people with you know fanboys of that gang's crowd in the comments. But so be it. Well, we're up to 18 now. That's definitely not as big as what we get on a Sunday live stream. But we'll see. We might still be getting some stragglers coming in and whatnot. And the main thing is that you know, these things are going to be out anyways after, so it's not like we're gonna miss it or something. Actually, let me take a look at one thing here while we're waiting. Update the just going to see if this helps the algorithm any. Customization, live chat replay. Okay, everything seems all right there. Okay. Oh, up to 20. 21. That's good. Ben says, for these surprise streams, you should use Venger's adopted catchphrase. Surprise stream, mother of the... Adino the Ads Knight says, thanks for the lively chat on the Double D stream last Wednesday. Those Black Lodge guys are full of themselves. Well, you know, what I don't get is their... I mean, I guess I know why it is. They've decided, you know, like they were part of that one kind of movement of these OSR YouTubers that aren't actually game designers. And I guess they, you know, when I got into the fight with the basic expert, they decided to stick with that side, you know. But, you know, so be it. But it's very funny when they try to accuse me that, oh, you know, the pundit is just jealous of anyone else who's successful, which is like really goddamn ridiculous, right? Because I'm constantly promoting other people's work. I'm constantly promoting other channels that are smaller than mine. I get people as guests. They come on to inappropriate characters, or well, at least on one or two occasions on this stream. I invite people to come on anyway, and you know, I'm sharing products of other people's work. And like, you know, I will even recognize if a product seems good if it's not from somebody that I particularly like, as long as it's not, you know, like a politicized product, right? If it's not something that the point of it is to push an ideological agenda. So you know, I don't often find people on the, you know, woke OSR whose game I can say I'd recommend. But for example, the basic expert, who I got into a very big fight with, I've always said that by the looks of it, though I haven't been able to read it myself, his Aztec game, Macweedle, does look to be like a pretty interesting, historically authentic game, you know, so I'm not going to poo-poo it or tell people not to buy it or something like that, you know. But yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. Also, the you know, there were a couple of the regular trolls, the ones that come on anytime I'm somewhere other than one of my channels where they're banned, and we're like saying, oh, you know, Baptism of Fire was so successful, but it's just a BX clone, right? Which is like freaking hilarious, right? To suggest, you know, my games are about as far from a clone game as you can get and still be OSR, you know. And it was very funny the other day, James, DM James, or of the James gang, who has also, like, he's fallen completely in love with Baptism of Fire because he's very into Slavic stuff, you know. He's Russian Orthodox, and he just loves all of that lore. And so he's done several videos talking about how great Baptism of Fire is. I'd show you Baptism of Fire right now, but Meatball is busy sitting on it, so I'm not going to bother her with it. So normally, right now would be the moment I'd be holding my book up for you to see. But yeah, so DM James has done a number of videos praising Baptism Fire, and I'm very glad about that. I had a different impression of what he thought of me, but you know, and you know, he has disagreements with me, but he recognizes a game that is good, right? He doesn't, so he's done the right thing there. But in his latest video, is very funny because he was trying to determine like what is the root source of Baptism of Fire as an OSR system, right? Because he thought it would be AD&D First Edition, but then other people suggested to him that it was base BX, right? And of course, the truth of it is that Baptism of Fire is a derivative of the Lion and Dragon system. Lion and Dragon was created in process of play of my 6.5-year-long Albion campaign, which had started as a Lamentations of the Flame Princess game. So when we began that campaign, we were playing Lamentations, right? Another game I recommend, by the way. And over the course of the game, I realized that even there, it was still not, and this is going to be relevant to what I'm going to be talking about later, by the way, that it was still not really accurate as a good way to portray the kind of level of medievalness that I wanted. And so we began, you know, we started to change the rules, and those rules eventually evolved to what at that time I called the pundit rules or whatever. That later in the Dark Albion book is the notes in the Appendix P, and that after that, when I published a fuller version, was Lion and Dragon, right? So Lion and Dragon is derived from Lamentations, and Lamentations is a heavily modified base BX clone, right? So my game, so Baptism of Fire, anyways, is like 3 steps removed from BX. Hey, Chris, good to see you here. That's my publisher, who is the creator of all the non-written parts of the incredible Baptism of Fire and Sword and Caravan. Double D's live stream from VentureCon is the first time I put a face to the name, Chris Miller. Mac, $2 super chat. Thank you so much. As usual, this live stream is not being monetized while live, so I will be very grateful for any super chats that people might want to do. I do read other people's comments, even whether or not you do a super chat. Maybe I'm stupid for doing that, right? Because if I said no, I'll only pay attention if it's a super chat, then I might make more money. But I like, if I see something I find interesting, I like to talk about it with my audience, right? But I am always very grateful to anyone who does a super chat. In Mac's case, it was tuna for meatball. That's right. Super chats help keep meatball in tuna. Let's see what else you guys are saying. Just want to give it a little bit more time before we get to the main topics. Gestra says, Pundit, can you explain why you don't like dice pool systems? Oh, there's a lot of reasons for that. First off, because a lot of them are fiddly and have probability types that are not as intuitive as a straightforward dice roll. A lot of them are not very good at doing what they're meant to do. I mean, even look at like Vampire the Masquerade, right? The things in the original Vampire book that it says you're supposed to be able to do with X number of dice in a power really do not match what you could actually do by rolling. And a lot of dice, part of this is that a lot of dice pool designers are not serious designers. And so they just think of a system, but they don't actually think about the consequences of the system. So they think, oh, that's a cool mechanic, but they're not actually looking at, well, what's the spread? Like, how does this work, right? How can we make it actually match, right? And it's harder to do that, of course, than if you're looking at what 1d20 plus bonus does, right, or something like that. So there's a lot of reasons. And a lot of games that use dice pools tend to be games that are not the type of games I like also, though not all of them. There have been some dice pool games that are pretty good in terms of games, not so much in terms of the mechanic. Starla says, what about Tunnels and Trolls? Don't they have a dice pool system? They kind of do, but not exactly. What they have is a collective combat system where, like, every character in a fight, all the party members roll their attack rolls, and you add those together and compare it to the added total of the opponents. Great Gold Worm, hello, how's it going? Okay, let me get a pipe going, and then I'll start. Oh, but I wanted to say something too about VentureCon. First of all, I want to say that VentureCon always, like every year that I've seen the pictures during or after the fact, it looks like everybody's having such a great time. And I know this for a fact for myself. Like, I've been to big cons and I've been to small ones. And usually small ones are a lot more fun in my experience. And so I'm sure that everybody who goes to VentureCon has a great time doing it. Now, today I was trying to get a haircut, right? Because my hair is quite disorganized right now, and partly it's because the barber that I used to go to, the one particular barber at the barbershop I used to go to, is no longer working there, and I don't really like how the other guy cuts hair, and so I was like trying to look around. I couldn't really get to anything. And at the same time as I was doing this, when I had lunch at a market, I was looking at the photos that were taken of like the gang at VentureCon, And I realized I probably don't need to worry about that, right? Like, not one of them were dressed like adults, right? It looked like, to me, from my perspective, and I get that if you're American, probably you think they all look totally normal, right? I'm sure you've looked at them, you didn't even think of how they were dressed, right? Um, but like when I looked at them, it looked to me like it was a hobo convention, like, really. So way too many adult men wearing T-shirts with images on them. That's not really proper at all. Um, so I think I'm probably all right, even if my hair is a bit um, disorganized. I'm not. I was like, oh, if I'm doing a live stream, I should clean up, right? Then when I think about almost everyone else who's in this part of the hobby that live streams and what they look like when they're live streaming, I'm probably okay. Let me see here. Um, Jeff Ramdekar says, what would you say are the differences in designing magic items for OSR games versus something like 5e? There isn't a tremendous difference there, right? Like, fundamentally, 5e does continue to be of the same kind of tradition. There's some slight innovations that 5e has done, but not a lot. The main thing is trying to, like, a lot of magic items aren't that interesting, right? And so that's one of the things that that's one of the things that the topic today could be connected to, in that, if you're not discerning how to apply the mythical and the legendary into a setting, then a lot of stuff that should be fantastical ends up seeming mundane, right? And that's not great. Jasper says, Pundit, in your day-to-day life, what language do you speak most? Well, I suppose Spanish by a bit, except that, whenever I'm tweeting in English, or, almost everything I'm doing online is in English, obviously video stuff. And also I have a number of friends and associates who are English speakers. So I'm speaking quite a lot of English here for somebody who's living in a Spanish speaking country as well, right? But I guess when I'm not alone, anyways, or when I'm not online, it's still a majority of it, I guess, would be Spanish. Chris Miller says, VentureCon was the first time in a while I could play with like-minded people. That's pretty good. Now you just got to, like, organize some people to do a regular game or something. Sadwig Changing says, I'm wearing a tux if I ever make it to VentureCon. Well, there is such a thing as being overdressed, maybe, but and I know it's summer over there, right? But summer doesn't necessarily mean you have to go around in t-shirts, right? And shorts are largely for hiking or the beach. They're not really, going around in shorts when you're an adult man seems strange to me. Chris Miller reports, VentureCon is small, about 30 people, but it was so much fun. Not a single woke person in sight. I will be going back next year. Well, I don't doubt it. Ryan Wilson, 1999. Thank you so much for that super chat. I don't know if that little one means it's the first time you've done a super chat or the first time you've done one here or whatever, but I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. He says, I'm curious, what do you think of exploding criticals in RPGs in general? Well, there's aspects where you can do that, right? It depends. You've got to take in mind, with any kind of critical sort of system or extra damage system, how lethal you want the game to be. Because remember, unless you're doing what is essentially a cheat, which I don't approve very much of, which is to say that player characters can do criticals to other things, but other things can't do criticals to them, right? That creates a disparity in the world, right? It makes it, unless there's some special reason in setting why player characters shouldn't be vulnerable to criticals, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So assuming that everybody can be hit by criticals, your player characters will ultimately be much more affected by criticals than their opponents will be, right? Like it's cool for a player to do a critical hit, but that they're going to, when they get critical hit, either their character is going to die or is going to suffer serious injuries that is a longer term impact on gameplay than if they do a critical hit on an orc and it just dies, right? So you have to keep that in mind, right? Like if you want a gritty game, my games have critical systems, right? Lion and Dragon has criticals, Baptism of Fire has criticals, Invisible College and Star Adventure, all of them have criticals of different kinds. And so they can have real consequences. You get like characters who end up like, who end up losing an ear or end up being lame in one leg or something like that because of the critical hit, and then they have to decide if they're going to keep on adventuring or what they're going to do, and things along those lines, right? But then the more you have the potential for a critical to go out of control, then you have to be really cognizant of the potential there for instant death or likely death for even characters that are at a certain power level, right? Because obviously any first level character, you get hit with a sword, you might just die from hit point loss, right? But with higher, the big difference comes in the point of higher level characters. If you want to have a game where a higher level character can potentially die from a lucky hit done by a low level character, then you can do criticals, right? If you don't want that, if you want higher level characters to have more protection, then you need to not do criticals. And in terms of exploding criticals, I don't know if what you meant there was things like exploding dice. So for example, in my games, you have to mark a kind of a difference between bullet and laser weapons, right? High-tech weapons versus low-tech weapons. Ranged high-tech weapons in my games tend to do exploding damage. Like even in Lion and Dragon, if you have a pistol, right, which did exist by that time, right, or a rifle or whatever, right, like the most primitive levels of gunpowder weapons. If you hit with that and you roll, let's say it's a D6 damage and you roll a 6, you roll again and you keep adding on every time you get a 6, right? So there could be, in theory, a guy takes a bullet and gets, 20 points of damage in one shot, right? And that's fine, but again, it means you have to see the consequences of both. I like my games to have this kind of high level of risk where even a low level monster could potentially kill you if they got really lucky, right? Now, obviously, the higher level you get, the more immune you are to that, but you're never totally immune, right? So that it creates a verisimilitude. I hope that answers your question. And the S Knight says, I hope VengerCon stays free from the DI crowd. Well, I think that just depends on Venger. Jestro Game says, Pundit, do you DM in Espanol? Yes, I do, actually. Right now, I was running 4 games. Unfortunately, one of those games I had to cancel because I've taken on certain responsibilities in a certain social club I belong to that caused time constraints for me. So now I'm running 3 games. That one game was, again, we were just starting, and so I decided, well, if I'm going to pull the plug somewhere, it's going to be there. And also the day of the week that it was being played on, which was a Friday, was inconvenient there, right? So when I was running 4 games, I had 2 of them were in Spanish and 2 of them in English. One of those 2 in English is the Sword and Caravan game that is the only game I play online. And then the other one is my Last Sun campaign, which you can find and listen to the audios of if you go to Bill the Elf's channel on YouTube, and it's got the audios of all of the, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, I think it is, of all of our sessions. And it's just audio, and I don't know how interesting people will find it, but I know that there's some people that have started to listen to all of them. And they are, when we're playing it, it's hilarious, right? And it's the weirdest game I've played. It's the longest game I've ever played. It's now well into its 11th year. So it's, heading to 12. No sign of stopping, so worth watching. And then the other game that I'm still playing in Spanish is my Baptism of Fire campaign, which is being played in Spanish, in person, of course. Chris Miller says, default clothing setting in Georgia is silk cargo shorts and t-shirt. Yeah, well, I guess so, but you could, like Southern gentlemen used to dress so fancy. What the hell happened? Gestro Game says Bautismo de Fuego. Yeah, it's sort of like that. Um, Shauner says, I won't go to places where guys are dressed in tank tops, short, and tennis shoes. Um, or worse, flip flops. Gestro says Crocs. Starlaw says you're the Giles of RPG YouTubers. I'm not quite sure what that reference is. Um, all right. Well, we got 40 people watching. Now, that's not bad for a Tuesday, right? I mean, it's not as much as on a weekend, but it's pretty good. See if there's any other last comments here. Gestro Game says, Pundit, how do you handle character advancement in an 11-year game? Well, first off, the Last Sun campaign that I run is Dungeon Crawl Classics, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but not all of you maybe. So in Dungeon Crawl Classics, you have characters that range from level 0 to level 10. 10 is the ultimate level, okay? But it takes a lot. Like if you're playing it straight, if you're not like pumping up the XP in a ridiculous fashion, it takes a really long time to get to the higher levels. So in the history of the campaign, we've had parties, some players have come and gone. There's only actually one player. Bill the Elf is the only player that was there from the very first session and has played all the way through. Him and me are the only two originals still in there, but we've gotten other players that have some of whom have now been playing for like 8 years, or 9 years. And so the gameplay in Dungeon Crawl Classics is also famously dangerous, right? Like it's pretty easy to die in Dungeon Crawl Classics. So everybody has had multiple characters and has had some characters die, right? And if your character dies, you start back at level 0, unless you had another surviving because when you start at level 0 in my campaign, you make 3 0-level characters, and when they get to 10 XP, which is what they need to get to be level 1, you keep one of them and the other ones just go away somewhere. And we've made it a rule that if that guy then dies and you still had 1 or 2 other 0-level survivors, you can pick one of those and get to start at level 1 instead of level 0. But that's the only condition, right? You start right back from the beginning. And so we've had a lot of people who've played characters that have gotten to high levels, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in Heidi's case, and then die. And we've only ever had so far 2 characters who have made it to 10th level. The first is Bill the Elf, and the second is Catboy. So advancement has not been a big problem. Now, when you get to level 10, essentially you can't get any higher levels. But in my Last Sun setting, when you get to level 10, at some point or another, you are sent a messenger chicken from God, which informs you that you may now quest to become an immortal, and they give you a little pamphlet that says, so you're 10th level, and so there are several different options of how you can attempt to become immortal, all of which are very dangerous and very difficult, but you can do it, right? And those of you who are familiar with like the BECMI rules probably know that I cribbed that concept from there, right? And of course there are several different kinds of immortals in the DCC set, in the Last Sun setting. So it's pretty good. It's working, and actually so far, even though they've both been level 10 for a while now, especially Bill has shown no interest at all in actually pursuing the immortal quest, and Catboy has just, he's been level 10 for like at least a few months of real time now. So, but he still hasn't gotten around to deciding what path he's going to take. I think he's like thinking about it. Sad Rings Rager says, Pundit parcels out XP like the cruelest miser ever conceived. Well, some of my players might agree with you. Um, John Edgar says, Pundit, does your game system have any sort of mechanic for sanity should players run into truly awful cosmic horrors, etc.? I guess it depends what kind of game system you're talking about. Like in Lion and Dragon, if you get some, there are many ways that you could be affected with potential madness, and there would be a saving throw mechanic to either you go crazy or you don't, right? The one game system which Meatball is sitting on, so I can't show it to you, is the Invisible College. So in the Invisible College, there is a sanity mechanic of a sort, which is mental trauma that you get from being part of the occult world, and that can lead to some pretty serious consequences if your characters don't like try to regulate it a bit, you know. And in that one, basically it has to do with a number of different degrees and in a number of different categories, and depending on how bad you get at some of them, you could end up becoming, you know, a catatonic or a psychotic person who thinks they're God, or, you know, other things like that. Or delusional in different ways, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know, some people, it's funny when you guys are still talking about XP here. Some people point out that in my Lion and Dragon, in my own system, because obviously Last Sun I'm using DCC, but in my own system, in theory, you could have a session where the players do no combat at all, and they could still all get one experience point. If the DM determines that to be a complete session, they all get one experience point, right? Which is in my game, the experience points are different, or in my games, the experience points are measured differently from the standard D&D model. But you know, basically, you need to get for the early levels, you need to get around 5 experience points to go up in level, right? So on that, and I've had several sessions where I've done that, right, where the players don't have any moment where they have like a real combat risk, but I still give them the XP award at the end because they did other important or interesting things. Jestro said, you guys are determined to keep me distracted from the main subject, but all right. What genre would you describe Aquelarre as? It's not OSR. Well, Aquelarre is the game system of Aquelarre is derived from basic fantasy very clearly, right? It's a rip-off of the kind of Call of Cthulhu RuneQuest type system, right? But in terms of genre, it's a medieval authentic game. If by genre you meant setting genre, it was one of the major inspirations for Lion and Dragon and Dark Albion. Max says, how do you award XP with a party that has first level characters in the same party as a 10th level character? Well, in Dungeon Crawl Classics, that's a bit easier because there you get experience points. Again, they're not the same as in standard D&D. So you get, for any combat encounter, you get between 1 to 4 experience points, depending on how dangerous the opponents were to the party. Okay. So if you're fighting a monster that was relatively simple to defeat, you'll get 1 experience point. If you're fighting monsters that are, you know, more risky, it's 2 or 3. Monsters that are really dangerous, 4, right? And of course, the definition of that depends on the level of the characters involved, right? So if you've got a mixed party, which I always do, right? Like literally, there's always like some guy who's first, second, or third level, and then there's guys that are level 10 in that party. What I do is I determine the risk overall to the party. And what that ends up kind of meaning is that lower level characters will get less XP than they would have if they hadn't been there with, you know, higher level characters to fight with them. And higher level characters will sometimes get a little bit more, like in a scenario where if there weren't first level guys there, I would have given them 1 XP. Maybe they get 2 XP instead because the lower level guys are there, right? But it does tend to balance out anyways, because lower level guys need way less experience points to level up. So gradually the lower level guys catch up to the higher level guys to a certain degree. All right. Jester said, never heard of basic role playing. Cool. Well, basic role playing is just the name of the system that all of Chaosium's games are based on. So, like Call of Cthulhu, RuneQuest, Elric, or Stormbringer, you know, those sorts of games. John Edgar says, sounds like the Invisible College is the kind of setting I'd really like. Well, we might talk a little bit more about that when I get to the part on conspiracy theories. Now, I was going to grab a pipe here. You guys have been going like crazy on the comments, which I really appreciate. I love answering your guys' questions, and sometimes that's more interesting than the topic I had come up with. So I guess we'll see if that's the case this time. Meatball, what's going on with you? Meatball, I brought a stack of my books to show off at key moments when I referred to them, just in case if there's people out there who in the group that have not bought all my books yet. Tell me what books you haven't bought yet, and I'll tell you why you should. You know, again, aside from super chats, if you want to support me, one great way to do that is by picking up my products. And right now, I don't think I had time to put them in the description. But if you check any of my videos, and including this one after we're done the live stream, there will be a full description of all of my products with links to where you can get them. And I think they're all great, and a lot of other people think they're all great based on how well they're selling. So I'm confident that if you pick up these books and you're a gamer, at the very least, you're going to enjoy reading them. And I really hope you'll be able to either play them or use them with other games, because obviously that's one of the benefits of the OSR. If you play D&D, you don't actually have to play Baptism of Fire. As DM James pointed out in his most, I think it was DM James pointed out in his most recent video that he did on Baptism of Fire, that you know, there's all these tables, all these mechanics and stuff that you can just port over to another OSR game. So there we are. John Edgar, Invisible College and Dark Albion. Well, Dark Albion was my first medieval authentic setting, and it's a setting that is essentially England during the War of the Roses. And so it details all of that in a very kind of Game of Thrones style. It has timelines and a list of all the famous nobles of the era, the conflicts, and so on. But then it also has all of the like medieval lore about monsters and magic and what have you. Now, that's not a rule book. That's just a setting book, right? So you can use it with any game system. And since it actually came out before Lion and Dragon, in that book, I use references to other types of D&D games too. Like, you know, there's lists. For example, that has a list of, you know, what kind of D&D spells a magician should have in Dark Albion if they're, you know, if you're playing a standard D&D type OSR game, which obviously my later books don't have because I got rid of the magic system completely and replaced it with the magical techniques. But other than summoning, I didn't want to put the techniques because I hadn't really fully fleshed all of them out yet at that point that I wrote Dark Albion. But it's a great game. It's you know, and it's medieval authentic. All of my games are games that are actually reflective of what the medieval world was like and people in the medieval world thought, and it assumes that everything they believed about the world was real. So monsters are real, magic is real, miracles are real, you know, God and the devil are real, all of that, right? And so it's a very different style of play. Like, you only think you've played medieval fantasy if you haven't played a medieval authentic game. And there are one or two other games that you could say are medieval authentic games aside from mine, but mine are, you know, in the OSR, in our OSR, they're the way to go, right? As for Invisible College, it's based on the same kind of rules as Lion and Dragon with some serious modifications because it's set in the modern era, and it's where player characters are members of a secret magical society that have training in real hermetic magic, and that fight against other secret orders in a secret occult war to determine the destiny of humanity. Will humanity be enslaved, destroyed, transformed into something horrific, or will it be allowed to spiritually evolve to its full potential, which is what the Invisible College wants. And so it's a combination of conspiracy game. It has horror elements, and it depends which way you choose to play it. Right? It has kind of like espionage or investigative elements. There's a lot of stuff in the book about like the occult branches of national secret intelligence of some of the major powers and things like that. And again, all of it is based on kind of authentic lore about how magicians think magic works in the modern era. Chris Miller says, having lived in India, I think Eras of India is a very well-researched setting. Well, thank you for that. I've had a few Indians say that too, so I appreciate it. Sadwings Ray says, well-researched is Pundit's middle name. Well, thank you very much for that. I'm blushing a bit, but I appreciate it. Gestro says, remember that one time, Pundit, when you were a villain in a D&D adventure? Yes, I do. That's the Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Yeah. That was very funny. I was in their heads. Jason Galindo says, any advice on starting or finding a gaming group? I'm a bad person to ask that about because, I mean, you could try to go on forums and ask around, right? Like, or Discord or stuff like that. And I'm sure that you can find, you just like, you got to make use of social media probably, either to find people in your area or to play an online game. I say I'm a bad choice for that because, you know, in Uruguay, I'm a bit of a celebrity, I guess you could say, in the gaming community. Uruguay has a pretty big gaming community. It's got, you know, multiple hundreds of, you know, if I was to guess, it's somewhere between 400 and 700 people who play RPGs in the capital alone. So it's a pretty good amount for a Latin American country, right? And they're very into it. And Uruguayans are club forming people. So there are like gaming clubs. There are gaming conventions that are sponsored by the Ministry of Youth of the government. There's also private gaming conventions that are more, you know, standard. And you know, because I am the premier game designer, like, you know, there are a couple of other people. There are some people who made like games that they self-published in Uruguay, and there's one other guy who's published some stuff in other in like for someone who published some Shadowrun products but years ago. But basically I'm it, right? Like I'm probably the most famous Latin American RPG designer at this point, and I'm certainly the most famous one in Uruguay. So whenever I'm starting a game, I like, there's a Facebook group of Uruguayan gamers, and I just, you know, even if I need to, because a lot of times I don't even need to do this, right? Because I've got a stable of gamers now that play with in my current games, and if I'm starting a new game, first some of them are going to want to play it, and they're going to know people who are going to want to play it. They're going to know people that really want to be in one of my games and stuff like that, right? And so as a rule, it's pretty easy for me to get a gaming group, right? So I wouldn't, you know, I don't have to do as much work as some other people might have to, right? But I would say just don't quit, right? Keep trying. And I used to be very dubious about playing games online, but if you have a good group, like my Sword and Caravan group is a great group. They all show up all the time. Oh, Meatball is transferred onto the lap. Hey, Meatball. You know, if you have a decent gaming group that shows up, that are, you know, adult people that are gonna, you know, play properly, then it's definitely better than not playing. Okay. And sometimes it can be almost as good as playing live, right? Like I think my Sword and Caravan game, which I play online, and we've got people there that are from all over the world, because it's the right people, they're committed and everything else. It actually ends up being nearly as good as playing in person, right? Like, and once in a while, there's a couple of things that get missed from that, from like the absence of the being in the same literal physical space, but it gets really close. So nowadays, what I would say is, if you can't find someone in your local area, then start an online group, right? Get people, get connected, talk to people, and do it. John Edgar says, Invisible College sounds like the Golden Dawn surviving to 2024 with real working hour medicine. Well, kind of, yeah. In fact, I guess I can reveal that the in the rules for the Invisible College, there are 3 different ways you can advance in level, right? So every time you go up in level, you can pick one of them. One is like the Templar route, which is that you're not training in magic, you're just training in either skills or combat stuff. One is Chaos Magician, which is basically that you're training in really experimental styles of magic. And the third is the college curriculum, which means each time you go up in the college curriculum, you get a new set of trainings, and that corresponds to your degree in the Invisible College. And the order of those techniques that are in the college curriculum of the Invisible College, which I can now show because Meatball has moved to my lap. There's the Invisible College book. The order that they're in is the order of the curriculum of the Golden Dawn. Right? So you got it in one, John Edgar. Gesture Game says, L&D is one of the best character generators. I use it all the time. Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Baptism of Fire has basically got the same one. I don't know if you saw the latest video from Unscripted and Unchained, DM Bloodworth. He was talking about how impressed he was with the character creation system in Baptism of Fire. Gesture says they're looking for group section of the RPG site. Yes, there. I believe there still is. Let me double check that right now. Sometimes we've shut down some groups and some sections, and let me see here. Well, there is a section on play-by-post games for some reason, and there is a section for news and adverts, and you could probably post in either of those. Call it looking for potential players. Xnard says, do you have a different video channel in Spanish? No, I don't. I don't do any YouTube videos in Spanish. How do you say a final boss of internet shitlords in Spanish? Fuck. El jefe final de los shitlords de internet. That's how it would have to be. Or los shitlords en línea. Chris Miller says Atlanta has a large gaming community. We have 3 conventions per year with 85,000 people, but 90% of them are super woke communists. Yeah. Well, that's one thing you got to do these days. I mean, but if you go, where you could try to find people is like, there are a couple of conservative OSR groups on Facebook. There's also the Inglorious OSR group on MeWe. Those have very active chats. You could try to recruit people in any of those. And I also know that there's like some based discords, OSR type discords, but I'm not in those. I don't really use Discord very much because I'm too much of a Gen Xer for that. I'm not one of these Gen Alpha kids with the skibbity toilet or whatever. I don't understand them anymore. So Discord is a step too far for me. Calvinani says, OGGM is running myself and others with small channels in a Gonzo sci-fi campaign. That's pretty good. I guess that's another thing you could do. You could like, if you really wanted to, like start a YouTube channel and do like live stream your games. But you know, if you do that, then you're going to your games, you're either your channel's not going to be very popular, or you're going to start hamming to the camera, and that could be a problem. Exnard, well, you're right that Señor de Mierda would be a literal translation of shitlord, but that's not really, that doesn't really mean anything in Spanish. Like it certainly doesn't mean the same as shitlord in English. Starlaw says, I'm waiting for an advanced version of Star Adventure, a sci-fi role-playing game similar to Baptism of Fire. You could call it Galactic Ember or Stellar Crucible. Well, I've got a bit of news for you, Starlaw. I'm not making that just yet, but just today, the latest issue of the Pundit Files that has come out is number 17, Merry Men and Sherwood, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I've also got the next 3 issues ready to go. And 2 issues from now, number 19 is going to be a product that will be kind of the first glimpse of the sci-fi setting that I've been working on, which I call Sons of Heaven, which is essentially, it's a Star Adventure. It's meant for Star Adventure, right? And it is, that particular Pundit Files issue is going to be about how to generate random planets in this particular setting, which is a setting where, it's set tens of thousands of years in the future. Humanity had at one point been enslaved by an alien race, but long ago in the past, the setting, they broke free of that and created a kind of confederation of humanity, and it looked like they were doing really well. And then a couple of centuries ago, there was a massive galactic war that caused the collapse of that confederation, right? Now humanity is scattered into different small groups that are all in a state of kind of collapse, and this is, you're adventuring in the aftermath of the sci-fi equivalent of the Bronze Age collapse. So everything's gone backwards, and now you're either adventurers looking for fortune from that, or maybe heroes trying to restore the Confederacy or the Confederation, or do something like that. So let's see here. So that'll be the first part of that. I'm kind of thinking of releasing a number of products in that line if that first one turns out to be popular. Jestro says it's hard to keep players engaged when doing online stuff. It hasn't been my experience DMing Sword and Caravan, but again, it'll really depend on the type of players that you manage to get. Ryan from Aquilith Media says, I can vouch for the MeWe group. MeWe's got a number of really good groups for OSR gamers, but Inglorious OSR is one of the most active. Sadwing says, still waiting on Penetrator game based on the era and area of El Cid. Well, it's something to think about. It's not at the top of my list. Jester is proud of having me translate shitlord. Jester says, how would you run a Stone Age setting? Well, I'm not sure I would. I'm a historian, not an archaeologist or something. Like, it's too far back for my taste. Though if I really was going to, I would like, Hammer films, like the Hammer horror films, Dracula, Frankenstein, all that. They did a whole series in the 60s and 70s that were all like cavemen exploitation films. We had like women in tiny leather bikinis and cavemen fighting dinosaurs and stuff like that. And like probably think the most famous one was 1 million BC or something like that. And it was just like it didn't bother at all with any kind of authenticity. But a lot of those were quite amusing. So I'd probably, if I was going to do something, I'd probably do something like that. All right, so I'm going to get to the main topic while I still can. We've got 38 people watching, because I think some of them got bored waiting for the main topic. Oh, 42. Okay, it's getting better now. Somebody must have said, hey, he's finally getting to the point. So what I wanted to talk about today is the incorporating myths, legends, and possibly conspiracy into your campaign world, and the difference between what that sort of thing involves. And I guess what led me to start with this was discussions I had on Twitter with people. In one case, and I'll try to not get stuck in the weeds here. In the first case, I haven't watched the Star Wars, I think hardly anyone has, the Star Wars TV series, The Acolyte, but it's apparently horrible, and I've learned a lot about it just by watching people complaining about it on Twitter, right? And it's very clear, like it's just ghastly, right? It's supposed to be set at the peak period of the Republic, and instead what it does is it presents the Jedi as basically evil and corrupt, and the Sith are actually the good guys, and evil is good. And then, like, apparently at the end of I hope I'm not spoiling it for anyone, but at the end of the series, the main character, who is this like young black woman that was born into a Sith witch coven that was then evilly kidnapped by the Jedi in an act of imperial colonialism, and was then drummed out of the Jedi Academy. She ends up going full Sith, and she kills her former mentor. And she's supposed to be the character, very clearly meant to be the character that everybody is supposed to like. Okay, she is the supposed hero of the story, right? Whereas the Jedi are the villains of the story, right? And so I did a post where I basically pointed out that how stupid is Disney for thinking that Star Wars gamers are going to love a series where the Jedi are turned into monsters, and where the character you're expected to cheer for is a ruthless murderer, right? And then I got some people complaining, and so in the process there, I had to talk about how Star Wars, because they were saying, oh, it's all black and white, and I'm like, look, Star Wars is a myth. It's heroic myth. It's what it conveys, that it's based on Joseph Campbell, for Christ's sake, right? It's the basis of it is myth. And so if you are then turning it around and doing a postmodernist deconstruction of it, it loses everything that it has that gives it any purpose, right? And they're like, oh yeah, well, but that's what people want these days. And I said, well, no, not really. That's pretty horrible, actually, and nobody seems to be liking it. And the proof of this is the sales, right? And so then these people said, well, oh yeah, nobody likes a show that has like elements of black and white, where it isn't just good versus evil, right? Like nobody liked Game of Thrones, right? And so I at that moment, I realized that I'm dealing with a kind of level of, how would we call it, symbolic illiteracy that is basically impossible to overcome. People don't understand the difference in levels of the genres of pre-modern literature, so as to be able to understand why is it that Game of Thrones is popular. And more importantly, for example, the Time of the Dragon, right? The new series had all the potential to not be liked. Game of Thrones ended kind of unliked because it got too stupid at the end. They introduced a black family, a black clan into the Game of Thrones setting, in the new one. So like the early reports, there were a lot of people who were super skeptical, but it turned out to be extremely popular. On the other hand, what is it? Rings of Power? Is that it? The Middle Earth TV show was a disaster, right? Everybody hated it, right? And The Acolyte was a disaster. And most of Star Wars being handled by the current group of woke idiots was a disaster. And you could just say, oh, well, that's just because one of them was doing good writing, the other one was doing bad writing. Sorry, I've got a super chat here from Chris Miller, $5. Well, thank you, Chris. Do you think Trump meets the criteria needed to become an American folk hero? Well, I don't think he's going to become an American folk hero. I suspect he's going to, well, I mean, I think he already is an American folk hero, for starters, right? He's larger than life while still being a person, right? But I think, depending on how things go, history is going to remember him in the context of a legendary figure, right? Like that, there's a difference in that, right? Like you have some characters in American lore who are folk heroes, quite a few actually. But then you have some that go kind of above that to be legends. One example of that is Teddy Roosevelt, right? Teddy Roosevelt is an American legend. He's more than just a folk hero. He's been turned into a superhero, right? He's kind of the Chuck Norris of presidents, right? Like he can do anything, you know. And an enormous amount of it is based on truth, right? But it then becomes larger than life beyond that, right? And it becomes this kind of legendary thing. And it happened in his own time, to the point that when he died in his sleep, and someone, I forget who it was, it might have been Bat Masterson who reported, but it was some reporter who said, you know, death came and took Teddy in his sleep, because if he knew that if Teddy was awake, he'd have a fight on his hands, right? That was that sort of level of legendariness, right? And as of now, at least as of that moment after the assassination attempt is a major step in raising him up from mere folk hero status, which he's already been for the last several years, to legend status, right? Like that will be remembered as one of the defining things of his presidency, and it'll cause his presidency to be remembered. It might, you know, whether or not it's remembered for other things, it certainly still might be, and there certainly are many things that if he wins re-election, that could be politically memorable or historically memorable, but he will be memorable as a larger than life legend of America, I think. How controversial he will be, it's hard to say. I mean, there were a lot of people that didn't like Teddy Roosevelt back in the day, but nowadays everybody likes him, right? So the tendency is that when you're larger than life, people start to forget the bad parts of it, and you know, like that's a part of how the legend goes. Anyways, that's my answer to that. Where was it? Oh yes, right. So these shows, there's nothing particularly that if you analyze it in a literary sense, right, that would, in a modern literary sense, that would say that Time of the Dragon should be more successful than Rings of Power or than The Acolyte. But part of the reason for why it is more successful is because it is playing to genre and the other two aren't. And that's because it's a different genre or a different literary genre, but not of the kind of literary context we have today. I'm talking about pre-modern literature. And in pre-modern literature, you have basically 3, possibly 4 different contexts outside of, let's say, religious parable, right, which is something we're not going to really go into. So you have myth, and myth is essentially, and this has to do with the symbolic world and how we can look at the symbolic world as kind of different dimensions of reality, right? So we're at the level of what is not myth, right? And in our day-to-day interactions, we live in a world of that clearly is not entirely black and white, and that clearly has a whole bunch of complexities and imperfections. We live in a world that is not pure, right? And there's a literature that exists of this world, right, which could be termed a chronicle. So Game of Thrones is derived from the Hollow Crown cycle, what's come to be known as the Hollow Crown cycle of Shakespeare's works about the War of the Roses, right? That was the major inspiration, very clearly, that George R.R. Martin had. He did a fantasy world version of that, and that's Game of Thrones. The Hollow Crown cycle is in turn based on the chronicles of the War of the Roses that existed, and it is a faithful record of what happened. Not faithful in the modern sense of everything in these records being accurate. Obviously, Shakespeare goes into directions that we know are not really correct by historical accounts, right? But what I mean is that the people in these accounts, in the Shakespeare cycle of the War of the Roses, which is really starts actually way back with Richard II and doesn't end until, technically, I guess you could even say, you could say Henry VII, right? So the characters there are human characters doing human things in a human world. And there are still obviously all the kind of paradigm of the late medieval and early Renaissance era, but they're meant to be people doing people things, right? And it's a chronicle of the things they did. And so that is a world where you have sudden unexpected violence that doesn't have a moral element to it, right? The Duke of York is crushing it in battle, and he's the Lancastrians are in full retreat. And then he gets cocky one time and he leaves his castle to fight what he thinks is a small force. It turns out to be a big force, and he ends up getting murdered by Kentishmen, right? And then that creates a massive crisis for the Yorkist side. There's no moral element to it. It isn't dealing in cosmic forces. It is a bit of an example of somebody who got too cocky and got himself killed, right? But that's coincidental, right? Lots of people die in the War of the Roses for no particular reason. Sometimes not even that they got cocky or anything like that. But I'm using that as one example, right? So that's a chronicle. At the other end of the spectrum, you have myth, and myth is the level of our storytelling, which is reflective of our reality, that is at this pure and abstract level, that is not at the level of ordinary human interaction. It is something that that has to represent archetypal forces, right? So there has to be elements of pure good, pure evil, pure law, pure chaos, right? There is a right and wrong. There can be heroes in myth that go from right to wrong or vice versa, right? And in some versions of myth, you have redemption as well as part of that, right? Or fall from grace, which is the other side of this, right? But you have these major kind of spiritual forces at play, and things that happen in myth happen for particular kinds of reasons. So the mythic level of pre-modern literature is about these giant archetypal forces at play, which you might say, well, that's not the real world, but it is kind of the real world, in fact, still, because archetypes are a part of the way we think. It's part of our psychology. Just the other day, just yesterday, I think, there was a live stream on Twitter between Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson. And in it, they were talking about a whole bunch of things. And some of it was pretty crazy. Some of it was a little dull. And then some of it was fascinating, right? But there was one part that a couple of leftists got really mad at, was when Jordan Peterson was talking about how kind of the defining archetypal images of masculinity and femininity in the Western world are Christ, and specifically the crucified Christ, right? The sacrifice as being the fundamental symbol of the masculine archetype, and as the feminine archetype, the Virgin Mary, and specifically the Mary with the child, right? This binary of Mary and the child as the feminine archetype in the Western depiction of this, right? And there were people that were basically saying, oh, this is just religious fanaticism, which, you know, if you know Jordan Peterson, he's not a religious fanatic, right? He doesn't look at religion in that context. And they were saying, oh, this is just stupid misogynism. This is what, like, the classic line of, this is what dumb people think smart people are like, you know, and stuff like that. And the only way they can say those things is if they've become completely illiterate at archetype and denying of reality, actually, which they're both, right? They have no understanding of archetype anymore, and they think that things like, you know, gender roles are completely in the air and can be completely modified at will and have no correlation with biological imperative or human nature, right? So what Peterson was talking about there is that that there is a fundamental archetypal psychological imperative in men to do the difficult thing, right? To engage in sacrifice of the self in order to fulfill a higher purpose and cause. And that is one of the things that is symbolized by the crucified Christ, right? And then in women, the imperative is that of being the mother of creation, that can generate light in the world in the form of the birthing and nurturing of futurity, of the future generation, and that is an essential part of female human psychology, right? And it applies even if you never, you know, if you're a guy, even if you never like sacrifice your life for a cause, and in a woman, even if you never have children, right? But it's still a part of an instinct, a profoundly, deeply evolutionary biological instinct that we have. And these are the things that get represented in archetypes. So, sorry, let me take a look at the chat here, because I've been going for quite a while on this. Oh, I think I just did a big jump there that I didn't mean to do. Okay, here we go. The Acolyte has a 12% rating on IMDb, says Chris Miller. Tegacy says, smart guy with the pipe, so I'm in. Well, the pipe, not everyone with the pipe is smart, but I guess there is some correlation to that. So Grey Goldworm says the Force is literally black and white. Yeah, it's got a light side and a dark side, and there are some of them trying to claim no, but you know, not all dark side users were bad in the old series. No, that's not true. They were all bad, right? Some of them might not have thought they were bad, but they were all bad, right? That's part of how, again, that's part of how archetype works, right? Is that you know, you don't decide what's good and bad. There is an objective good and bad, and you decide, and you can only try to deny the fact that you've gotten on the wrong end of it, you know. Grey Goldworm says, I don't want Star Wars to be Game of Thrones. Yeah, nobody does, right? Let's Log of War says he was Trump was a folk hero even before he entered politics. Sadwings Radio says Andrew Mad Lad Jackson. Well, Andrew Jackson was definitely a folk hero. I don't think he persevered in the same way as some other people to a legend status, right? Chris Miller, $2, but my moral relativism, yeah, really. Let's see here. More stuff about prehistoric. Oh, it looks like okay. I'm not sure if this means I'm going over people's heads. If I am, let me know. Or if you're just really enraptured by what I'm saying. It's either one or the other, and that's a bit of a problem. There's 43 of you watching, so I'm not boring you whatever I'm doing, you know. Jeff Randicard, $2 Canadian. What about archetypes as they apply to D&D races? Well, that's really good. I was about to get into that, right? So At the level of myth, and we'll get to legend later, because you'll notice there's a step in between there that I didn't actually touch, right? There's the chronicle on the one hand, which is if you're, and what I'm going to say is this: you need to decide if you're making a setting, whether writing a setting or making just your campaign world, what you want that setting to be in terms of its genre, because a setting can have bits of all of those things, but it can only really be one of those things, right? Your setting can be a chronicle, it can be a legend, or it can be myth, right? Myth is pretty difficult to be, right? But you could do it. You could myth more often. What you can do is incorporate moments of myth into a campaign, which you do by having like you have the world of men, right? The world as it is, and then there can be moments in the campaign where either in specific places or at specific times, in the sense of certain events, that suddenly the mythic, the archetypal, manifests in the world in some form and overwhelms that mundanity into something bigger, right? Like something epic that becomes myth for a little while. And that happens in real life too, right? And that's where we get like certain modern myths that persevere over time, right? And that's why there are myths that start out as people, right? That then become gods or things like that, right? There's gods that were never people, but then there's also people who later on were turned into divinities, probably, right? Like in Hindu mythology, you have like Vishnu and Indra. Those were always gods. They were, cosmic gods or gods of the lightning bolt or whatever else, right? But then you had people who were so badass that eventually they became gods, right? Like, like Rama and probably Krishna, and that happens in a lot of places and in a lot of contexts, right? So if you're going to play a game that is mainly meant to be chronicle, and that's going to make it different, right? Because in a chronicle type of game, what you want is a game that is going to be grittier, that is not going to, and that doesn't mean it can't have heroic themes, right? Like there are lots of heroic stories within, for example, the Third Crusade, right? There are epic stories that emerge out of that moment in time, and same thing with the War of the Roses. But on the whole, it was a human endeavor, and it's full of like human black and white, human shades of gray rather, and it has, it has characters who at times reach mythic levels. There's a moment in the Third Crusade when there's this massive army that was put together by Saladin. He's coming in there. He's trying to retake one of the cities that had just recently been recaptured by the Crusaders. And the Crusaders were taken unprepared. And Richard the Lionheart gets out of the door of the city. He says, we're going to have to fight for it, right? And he goes out there with like 40 dudes against hundreds and hundreds, thousands of Muslim warriors. And they probably thought they were going to the death, but then this thing happens, right? By then, Richard Lionheart was very famous there, and he had fought another major battle where they had been terribly outnumbered also, and he had massacred the forces of Saladin. And this time he charges forward with this tiny group, and like a wave, they open up around him. They're all so terrified of Richard the Lionheart, who they called Alankiltar, that none of them would stand. None of them would even try to fight him. And they just panicked completely, right? And so they spread out like a wave as he moved in. And so that's a mythic moment within the context of things that happened there, right? But on the other hand, Richard the Lionheart was a complete bastard, right? Like, in fact, he was much less, he had much less of a code of honor than Saladin did. One has to say that. And that's where you also get into legend, right? Where you have, that there's legendary elements there because you have Saladin became a figure respected by the Crusaders in spite of him being the head of the hated infidels, right? Of the hated Muslims. And likewise, Richard Lionheart became legendary in the Muslim world. So that is elements of legend, right? So getting to what Jeff asked in the super chat, I haven't forgotten. This is one of the places where you have certain effects. So when you're determining how characters should be, right? If you're going to make your characters have legendary elements, legendary backgrounds, you better have a mechanic that allows you to do that, right? Like, or create options. You know, if you want players to choose, I always prefer for them to roll, but if you want them to choose, the options have to reflect elements of legend. There should be stuff that makes them already kind of a little bit larger than life, even at low level, right? On the other hand, if you want it to be more of a chronicle, then they should have backgrounds that start from a kind of a relatively humble beginning, right? Like that they could have some kind of background element, but it shouldn't be like, you know, that they were secretly hidden as a child because they were the illegitimate child of a king or something like that, you know? It should be more like, I don't know, your character served in a monastery for a while and learned how to read Latin. You know, so these are the differences, right? Now you can in a chronicle based game, you can do stuff that approximates the legendary. So, but then what you have to make sure of is that the legendary stuff only shows up lightly, right? Just a light sprinkling, right? Like you don't want to put too much hot sauce on there because otherwise you lose all the other part of it, right? If everything is legendary, then it loses the purpose, right? So, for example, in Baptism of Fire, I have background tables for characters, and there are 4 tables that are each on a d20, and you roll a d10 to see which of the 4 tables you do. But it's not an equal chance of each one. Table A is 1 to 4. Table B is 5, 6, 7. Table C is 8, 9. Table D is a 10, right? And the background story gets weirder from table A, B, C to D, right? So D is going to tend to be much weirder stuff than stuff in table A, right? And that means that characters are not very likely to get legendary stuff, but they might, right? In terms of races in D&D, races in D&D are very archetypal, which is kind of unusual because the rest of D&D play is what I would call legendary, not mythical, but legendary, right? The characters are going through the hero's journey, and they very quickly, you know, at low level play, it's not really, right? But that's part of the hero's journey also, right? You start as the peasant boy and you end up the king, right? But D&D as a system is also set up in such a way that after you get to a certain level, it becomes much harder to kill you. And that then becomes very much a part of legendary play, because legendary characters shouldn't die for just any reason, right? If they die, it should be in a very big battle that causes them terrible harm or some other terrible way of dying, right? But they're you know, if you're a 10th level character and an orc, a one hit die orc gets a lucky hit with you with a spear, he's going to do 6 points of damage. That's not going to kill you because you've by then got 60 points of damage, right? There's literally no way that one orc can beat you. Whereas if you're doing it in a chronicle type setting, like Lion and Dragon, you could have a 15th level warrior and you could have a 0 level peasant that gets a natural 20 on the attack roll, and then he rolls on the critical table and gets a 20 on the critical table, and you fail a saving throw and you're dead. That's it. Your guy was killed by a 0 level peasant, right? So that is the difference between like chronicle and legendary, right? But the races in D&D are at least I mean, and I'm talking about old school D&D here, right? Are legendary races. And that kind of makes sense because it's the only thing that will make them particularly special, other than, let's say, their mechanical powers like infravision and stuff like that, right? That gets lost in modern D&D. In modern D&D, they are instead basically useless, right? They're just costumes. That's all they are. They're not even, you know, a chronicle element because there is no definable culture to them. There's no definable behavior to them. There's nothing that makes them actually non-human. They're just humans with funny parts, right? Like somebody recently posted on Twitter. This wasn't my post, but I kind of wish it was. And I'll probably say it was later. They posted in one D&D, basically all the races are just tieflings, right? So they're all just abominable things that have no actual purpose anymore, right? And the tieflings aren't really tieflings because they're no longer evil, right? The whole point of a tiefling is that you're part evil, but of course in one D&D there is no good and evil, so they're just funny looking guys with horns, right, or whatever. They have it's just a skin suit now, right? But what I would suggest to a 5e player is turn that around, make the classes, the races have things that define them, that make them very much non-human, as in stuff that they do that's non-human and stuff that they won't do that is human, right? That will make them stand out, and then that is part of developing to legendary or mythical play. Let's see what we've got here. Mog of War says, myth is probably kept in backstory. Well, yes, as a rule, yes. Unless you're playing a game where your characters are basically demigods, myth is something that, like, a myth is not handled well by D&D. I mean, not in the terms of making a campaign where the characters are mythic. That is not something that D&D manages correctly. Now, it can do like high fantasy legendary play, right, where the characters are epic heroes. That they're able to do to different degrees of success depending on the system you're using and whatnot, right? But like mythic level play requires a different system, like Lords of Olympus or something like that. Lords of Olympus is obviously mythic play. You're literally playing the children of Greek gods. Mog of War says, Indra and Heracles possibly the same outfit. No, Indra is not that. Indra is the archetypal ancestor of both Zeus and Thor, whereas Heracles is actually probably a guy. He's probably someone that, maybe it wasn't, it's very different from the legend, but Heracles may well have been a dude who actually existed, How do you, Gesture asks, how do you explain a chronicle to your players? Because I asked one of my players keeps looking for narrative hooks in our games as a story gamer who's trying to branch out. Well, that's kind of two different questions you're asking there, Gesture. So first of all, how would you explain a chronicle to your players? Well, what I would say, I wouldn't use that term with my players. I mean, some of my players would get it, right? But what I would say is, in this game, you're playing characters that are in a real world, a real virtual world, and there are people behave as real people, and it is not a literature, it's not a literary world. This world is not a story. This world is a real world where real things happen in it. So stuff can happen by accident, stuff can happen that is not part of a plot, and there aren't really things that are bound to happen because of a plot. So you don't you should not assume. So for example, you should not assume that if you go into a dungeon, that dungeon is only going to have monsters that are at your level, and so you should never run. There may be monsters that are much more powerful than you can handle in certain places, right? And then this kind of ties into sandbox, because not all Chronicle games have to be a sandbox. You could have a plot in a Chronicle, but the plot had better be one that you're skillful enough not to use literary references from novel type stuff, right? Like it shouldn't have, this is the big bad guy and this is how he's going to die, right? But it can have, well, there's this timeline of events, right? So most of my games, because they're set in actual history, have a timeline of events, right? But Baptism of Fire has a timeline. It goes from like around 975 to around 1048 or so, right? And so there are going to be things that are going to happen every year, and that is in a way a kind of plot development, but it's not a plot development that is based on crafting a carefully woven story that follows the structure of the modernist novel. Novels are a big problem, right? Like I've said this many times, no one listens to me, but I think the novel was a disastrous mistake for Western civilization to embrace. Because it replaced stuff that was much deeper. But anyway, so that's what I would say, right? Like you can have some hooks in a game, but a lot of the hooks should be either a reflection of what is really virtually there, right? So your characters are are traveling along in a real world, and like in Baptism of Fire, what you would do is you would be rolling to see if there are encounters in the woods. Some of those encounters might lead to adventure potential because what an encounter could be with a village in the middle of the woods. That village might have a problem. There's a table for that too, right? And you guys might want to go and solve that problem. But there's nothing there that is like the DM has prearranged this. You're doing this through the use of random generators that are reflective of the world in which you are, right? And so that is the main thing, is you have to make them understand that their character is not a character from a TV show, not a character from a movie. He's a character, or from a novel. He's a character that is alive in a real world where there are real world consequences, and where there isn't some kind of great narrative that is guiding the path of that world. Mog of War says, this is very clever, Mog of War. I'm giving you huge kudos here. If the game is a chronicle, it becomes the player's responsibility to make things heroic. That's right. It also is their free will to make it heroic or not, right? Because they can also be villains if they want to, or they can also be, let's say, self-centered rogues, right? Maybe not fully villains, but like that is one of the features of a chronicle, right? Where there isn't a call to heroism. They're not there. There's nothing that is going to force them to be heroes. They have to decide: do they want to be the hero of the story, the villain of the story, or not engage in the story and go and just try to make their own way, right? And that is in some ways reflective of the kind of alignment elements of my games, So what else have we got to say here? Not too much hot sauce on the tacos, says Chris. That's right. Tabletop Cheer says, well, one thing's for sure, the RPG pundit niche is safe. Wizards of the Coast will never touch historical fantasy at all. It would absolutely obliterate the ethos they push in all their products. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I have got a niche that is pretty well protected. There are a few other people who can make certain historical games, but I think mine are pretty good, and I'm not very worried. I'm not very worried that 5e steps on my toes, or 1D&D much less. Mexican orcs. Oops. All right, I think I'm caught up on the comments here. Sapphire Dragon said, I had a philosophy professor saying novels are the trash heap of literature. I think it was about Moby Dick. Well, yeah, exactly. Now, there are some novels that are very good for novels, right? And that have some value. But for the most part, they were a mistake. Xnard Prime says, do you ever use I Ching for generating scenarios or random encounter tables or random tables? Do you recommend that? I never do that, no. I've been studying the I Ching for over 30 years now, and I'm pretty well known for being quite good at using it. But I don't really I don't mix, like like what's Joe Bittman did a bunch of stuff. He did a Lamentations source book that was based on real magic, right? In the sense that it like has real magic stuff in it and stuff like that. And Venger puts sigils in his books. I don't do any of that stuff, right? Because to me, that's just silly. That's like like the King of the Hill thing, right? With when he goes to the Christian rock concert, right? He goes, you realize you're not making Christianity better, you're just making rock and roll worse. Like it's the same thing as far as I'm concerned, right? One thing is what you're doing in your spiritual world, and the other thing is what you're doing in RPGs, So like the Invisible College is full of stuff that like is based on real world occultism. And if you bought the Invisible College and you read the Invisible College, you would end up knowing more about like real world occult systems than than every Wiccan on the planet, and then probably most people who call themselves occultists on the planet. Okay, you would get, like, if you read it carefully, you would have a very profound education into like occult lore of the modern world, but you would not know how to do any magic at all. Right? Like you would know how it works, how it's supposed to work, or how it's supposed to be done, but there's nothing in there that would actually teach you real magic or something like that, or that, and there's no real magic in there that is, been used to make the book. I don't get that at all. That seems to me to be amateur hour at the circus or something. Tabletop 2 says, honestly, with how embedded in D&D the concept is of bioessentialism, it's impressive how much Wizards of the Coast has tried to remove it from the game. They essentially had to remake it to, well, that's the story of everything in Western culture right now, isn't it? Logavor says, rolling the I Ching to decide events. That sounds unironically dangerous to me. I don't think there is any danger there. I also just don't think there's very much purpose to it, The I Ching is really just, in many ways, it's a 3,000-year-old AI. That's what the I Ching is. That is based on an incredibly prescient model of how time works, right? Like stuff that, it's shocking how similar it is to modern physics theories of time. There's a reason why Niels Bohr put the taiji as his symbol when he was given when he was given a title by his government, and he needed to have a coat of arms. He put it in his coat of arms because it's an ancient symbol that is nevertheless reflective of how he understands time and space to work. All right, so carrying on here. So incorporating, making sure your game works as a chronicle means that you have to have the right kind of combat mechanics, you have to have the right kind of character creation mechanics, and your world has to be a chronicle type world. It has to be a real living world, right? If you want to incorporate myth, your world has to be a mythical world. It has to be a world full of archetypes and full of epic events, right? And so your system has to be an epic system. You can't have a system that's grim and gritty and play a mythical world, right? And you have to have, the world has to have campaign events that have symbolic meaning to them, right? Like that things represent concepts, they represent moral forces, they have events that happen because it is meant to reflect an aspect of our human reality that is at that very deep level of the underlying instinctual spiritual psyche, right? That myth, like the real reason myth exists, is partly ancient people wanting to understand the world. And part of the understanding the world was like to understand, well, okay, like why do storms happen, right? And stuff like that. And there's myths about that. But the much deeper part and the much more important part is that it was meant to have a system by which you could preserve and transmit the vital survival lessons of fundamental principles of how human psychology works, like what the human experience is about, in terms of rules about what to do and what not to do, right? So like, for example, the 10 Commandments, right, are brought down from from the mountain by Moses. They were given to him there by God, right? And he comes down on to back to the people with it. Those 10 commandments are not like things that were like, there wasn't a guy who wrote that story in Exodus and just came up with those commandments, right? Whether or not you are a literal believer in the Bible, what you have to understand at the same time is that those 10 commandments are commandments that are moral lessons that are essential to human survival and have been for 200,000 years, right? They're some of the most fundamental things of, like, these are the most basic rules that ensure that you will be able to have a functioning society that will be able to last, that will be able to survive, and the part of making it enshrined in this myth is to preserve that understanding, because otherwise those understandings can collapse very quickly, as we have seen in our society, right? Where some things that were fundamental beliefs of every culture, never mind Western culture, right? Look at the stuff that pretty much every human culture has believed since the dawn of time, that every human culture has understood as being important, and maybe expressed it slightly differently in one place or another, right? But there's variations of those same commandments in every culture, right? And if you unravel the acceptance of the underlying myth, then very quickly the basis for bothering with following those commandments disappears, and then very soon the idea that those commandments were ever important disappears, and then people simply don't have them, and then you end up having the consequences of not having them, right? So the point of that is that in your game, at least in the context of what we're talking about here, there's a much bigger point for the survival of our civilization. But in the context of RPG design, it means that in your game, the world a mythic setting needs to reflect those and the mythic parts of a setting, right? Because, like I said, most D&D games are not going to be a mythic setting, but they're going to have elements of myth in them, right? The mythic stuff has to be stuff that reflects those, like, fundamental greater truths that are really purely truth at the archetypal level, but that filters down to the human level in the sense largely of not fucking up, right? Like, that we know you're not always going to do this, but this is actually the safest way to be as a people, right? And as a society and as an individual, you know? So that's the deal. Chris Miller says he had to go. Have a good night. We'll see you later, Chris. I don't know if you've already left, but if not, thank you for coming. So that's more or less the deal about incorporating these different aspects. You need to make sure that if you want your game to be purely a chronicle, that you don't mix it up with a bunch of mythical stuff, and also that you don't mix it up with, like, trying to make it like a TV show or a novel, right? If you're wanting to have legendary characters, then you need to make sure that the mechanics of the game allow the characters to become legendary, and not to end up like you don't want the guy in Game of Thrones that is clearly immune to all plot, right? Or whatever, that has plot immunity, right? And you don't want the guy in, like, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars who is defeated who gets taken down in a really stupid way, right? Which is, that has happened once or twice in Star Wars, right? Like, a lot of people were not happy at the time. I don't know how many of you are old enough to, well, I think probably most of us are here. We're mostly Gen Xers here, I think. We're old enough to have watched, Return of the Jedi when it came out. And the general consensus of everybody there, including, elementary school-aged me, was that they did real wrong by Boba Fett, right? Boba Fett went out like a bitch, and that wasn't cool. Like, he should have gone out in a much more epic way. And why did that bother Star Wars fans? Why did it bother them then, and probably still bothers them now? Is because it doesn't live up to legend, right? it was absolutely, it would have been perfect for Han Solo to take out Boba Fett. But for Han Solo to take out Boba Fett the way he did was just dumb, right? And that's what you don't want to end up doing in your game. Okay, so one more thing, because, a lot of times in games you're going to have like intrigues and conspiracies and things like that, is to talk about conspiracy theories in game. But before I get to that, I'm going to just try to catch up here with the comments to see if there's anything else to add. I think I'm fairly caught up, but let's see here. Starlaw asked, would it be easy to run a Kolchak the Night Stalker campaign in the Invincible College Reporters Fight Monster? Yeah, it definitely would be. Monster or evil group or whatever. Yeah, you could do that. That's totally possible. Matthew Sedans asks, what do you think is the best thing about archetypes? Well, the thing about archetypes is that archetypes are real, right? Like they are a real thing, right? And people end up embodying different types of archetypes, right? We kind of know this, right? Like there's a truth in them, and having characters that are archetypal means that they end up following a certain kind of path that taps them into a predetermined sort of expression of something bigger than themselves, right? Like to be the archetypal warrior or the archetypal thief or things like that, right? Like all the character classes are archetypes in D&D. And so you can go hard on that. And that means that and not every version of that archetype is going to be the same, of course, right? Like there are certain different types of warrior archetypes, right? But going along with that is both useful in terms of creating a certain type of story, the legendary story specifically, and it's also mechanically useful in terms of having characters having each different moments to shine, right? Niche protection, right? One of the places where games go wrong is when every character can do a little bit of everything and then no character does anything particularly special, or where worse still, where you have class type things and like in some versions of D&D, there are many classes that end up killing things better than a warrior does, often or always, and that's terrible, right? So having the niche protection is a very important part of it. That means that at certain moments, each different class will have its time to shine, right? Let's see what else we've got here. Great Goldworm says Boba Fett death, LOL. Yeah. John Edgar, you had to go also. I'll see you later, John Edgar. Thank you. Guess you can watch the rest later. All right. So, conspiracies. There are conspiracies that are going to be, again, there are conspiracies that are authentic conspiracies, and then there's conspiracies that are legendary conspiracies. And I'm using the word conspiracy here, but this could mean stuff like, secret societies. It could mean, anything that is kind of, that is going on behind the surface of the setting, right? And you have to think about that too in the context of how does this work for your setting, right? If your setting is a chronicle type setting, it should work one way. If it's a legendary type setting, it should work another. So to put this into an explanation that I think will be more interesting, let's talk about what has been going on recently with there's been a large number of conspiracy theories that have just popped up in account of the Donald Trump shooting, the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Right? You have some people that thought Donald Trump staged this assassination. You have other people that think that the U.S. government, in some degree or another, either the Secret Service or the Biden White House or whoever, attempted to assassinate Trump. And then you have ideas in between those two. And you know, like, let's start with the conspiracy theory of Trump engineered for someone to take a shot at him, right? Like that that one's pretty much gonna be discountable very quick because first of all, Trump isn't very good at keeping almost anything a secret, right? And he's, you know, there's constantly people around him that betray him, right? So like, you know, like it's very unlikely that he would have been able to do this in the first place. But furthermore, the idea is asinine, right? Like you're not going to, you know, I'm not an expert on guns by any means, right? But you're not going to tell a guy, listen, what I want you to do is take a shot at me and get it so close that it nicks my ear, but doesn't otherwise hurt me, right? And you could have the best goddamn sharpshooter in the world, and he would say, no, we can't do that, right? There's just way too much variable risk. You know, however good I am, the risk is still going to be too high that just by, you know, accident, I could end up killing you, especially because you're going to be talking and moving as you're doing it, right? So, you know, it can't be done. Right, like the idea that much less some you know 20-year-old, right, to do that is just ludicrous, right? But then there's the whole question about, you know, well, the Secret Service, all of the blunders that took place, you know, the fact that Trump was allowed out there, and all of that stuff. And you've heard a lot of excuses coming from different people, but there's essentially three ways you can look at this, right? The first is that the Secret Service was massively incompetent, right? Like there was huge levels of incompetence that was just so epic that it led to this catastrophic failure. The other is that they were somehow in on it, right? That they, you know, maybe not all of the Secret Service, but people in the Secret Service were told, let this happen. You know, probably not like Trump's own immediate bodyguards were told, but somebody was told, you know, this guy's going to be there, don't do anything, right? And so then the shot went out, right? And that this was like a conspiracy, right? Now, I'm not saying that is what happened, by the way, YouTube. I'm not saying that at all, right? And I'm really not, right? But you know, those are, in a sense, both of those are kind of conspiracy theories, because the idea that there was like that the Secret Service was massively incompetent in like a structural level is itself a kind of conspiracy theory. And I know people are talking about that. They're already talking in the chat about DEI hires. And that's right. And it certainly can be argued that the Secret Service may have, because of its current leadership, declined in its level of ability. That's certainly possible, right? It is also possible that a number of unique other factors that have nothing to do with that got in the way too, right? Like there was, for example, multiple events happening on the same day, right? Like you had, I think it was Nancy Pelosi or Jill Biden, one of the two was actually also in that state on that day. There were also Secret Service that had to do security at the RNC, which is already starting to be set up there. And there was a total lack of coordination with local law enforcement, which was the big mistake. It's not local law enforcement's fault, apparently. At first I thought, oh, well, it's probably local law enforcement that screwed up. But based on what we found out since the recent testimony that happened in Congress, it looks like actually the people that screwed up was the Secret Service. They didn't get anybody to get there to liaison with local law enforcement, and so it was completely messed up, right? But that doesn't mean that the whole that the whole institution is screwed up. It means that it's had failures of leadership, which is exactly why, the head of the Secret Service needed to resign and possibly have other consequences. Who knows? But none of that necessarily means that they were in on it. But there is another element to this that people should consider, right? Like, okay, have you ever worked at a job that really sucked, right? And you're working in a job that really sucks. Maybe once it was even good, and then it starts to suck. And everybody agrees that it sucks. Everybody who works there thinks it sucks. And it's a job, whatever it is. I don't know. You're working in a theater or something, or you're working at a hardware store, and the boss is a moron, and the supervisor is an idiot who thinks he's competent, and everybody's on your case. And generally, if you know that if you ever worked in a place like that, which I only did once in my entire life, but I it's enough for me to recognize how that works out. Everybody there, even the people who are competent, are demoralized, right? And that demoralization comes at a cost, right? You might be the most dedicated guy in the world, the most disciplined guy in the world, but the very fact of being in that environment means that you are not going to be operating at your peak ability. Even if you're like intending to do a good job, you probably do a good job, but you won't go that extra mile, right? And I think that a lot of what happened there is because of those factors. Yes, the head of the Secret Service was terrible, was a terrible choice, a DEI hire basically, and somebody who was incompetent at their job. They were bringing in bad people that were then also getting in there, and that was causing other people probably to retire or to then start feeling very demoralized about their job. And that in itself causes a terrible and instant decline in any organization. That's why, like, when you're talking about organizations that deal in life or death, stuff like the army, the police, fire departments, the Secret Service, people, you need to worry about that, right? Like, that is one of the essential things that you have to avoid at all costs. So, like, to me, I think a big part of it was there was nobody that was ordered to let the shooter go or let the shooter take the shot, right? Like, I don't think it is impossible for some of the people involved to want to assassinate Trump, right? Like, but and there might have been some people there that also were not doing their peak job because they were DI hires who owed their life, their career to the Democrats, and therefore were not especially interested in doing their peak job in protecting Trump, perhaps, right? Because that's one of the things, one of the characteristics, that one of the reasons why the Secret Service has to be and historically was such a high efficiency job, or a high efficiency department rather, was because the people that were there were trained to treat everybody that they are protecting as the vital asset, and to do their absolute, and to put aside any personal conception of that person, right? Like, you are there to protect that person, right? And so if you're hiring people who are not being hired for that correct type of psychological profile, because not everyone can do that, and those people are then going, well, I don't like this guy as much, so maybe I won't jump in the way, right? Like, that's when you're going to get into a big problem. Right? So anyways, that's my, I might as well have shared about my opinions on this issue. But what I'll say, so let's say now you're trying to introduce elements of kind of secret plots and conspiracies in a game. Let's look at some of the basics of that. In the first place, you are not going to be able to make a game that is essentially a chronicle game, right? Let's say a game that is meant to reflect a realistic world and have a spanning global conspiracy of that is entirely kept secret, right? That's not how conspiracies work in the real world. In the real world, as soon as you have more than 3 people talking about something, there's a very high chance that it's coming out, right? And there are certainly secret organizations, right? The mafia or so on, right? And there are also open groups with agendas that are not always publicized, but that are easy to publicly derive, like say the WEF, right? Like those are open, right? That's an open. The WEF is a perfect example of an open conspiracy, right? They do YouTube videos about what they want to do to you, right? And that is an example of a conspiracy that could exist in a chronicle, right? In a chronicle, what won't be believable is that there's this shadowy conspiracy where, I don't know, 1 in every 10 people are actually members of the of the cult of Moloch, and you just haven't. Nobody's ever noticed, and nobody who's not a member has ever known this, right? Like you have to avoid that, right? The more you go into the level of the legendary, the more you can have conspiracies that are more secret, especially if the legendary also involves supernatural elements that allow you to justify why nobody has known this, right? The idea of a government cover-up is pretty ridiculous, right? Like the government has covered up things, of course, but the things that they've covered up in the sense of everybody has a very strong suspicion that this has happened, and they have simply classified it in a way that you can't see it, right? But for the most part, anytime you have a large number of people becoming aware of anything, if you've got 10, 20, 30 people in a conspiracy, somebody's going to be blabbing about it in that 10, 20, or 30 people, right? That's why anytime you have more than like 3 people involved in a murder, that they're all going to get caught, right? Like it's so, like the likelihood that those people will take to and hold to a vow of silence, unless they're like super expert trained people, is almost zero. Right. And if you have a group of 30 people and they're all super expert trained, it's still going to come out because somebody's going to have written something down and then they're going to die and somebody finds it in a box or whatever. Like it's eventually going to come out. Right. It is extremely hard to keep things secret. Right. Speaking as someone who is in a society that has some secrets, and so but as you approach legend, you can go more into that, right? Like in the Invisible College, there are secret societies that nobody in the mundane world knows about. And the explanation I have for that is what I call paradigm blindness in the book, is that normies essentially don't want to know what's real. And so they will end up, their subconscious will end up rewriting their memory. If they see something obviously supernatural, they will then imagine it away. And in fact, that's real. That's a real thing that happens. People have paradigm blindness all the time, right? There was a Indian mystic named Paramahansa Yogananda who wrote a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, and a big part of his book is it's set in India, right? And so we're not talking even about the West here. We're not talking about the rational West. We're talking about the Hindu world, right? Where a large part of the lesson, the moral lesson he wants to put in there, is about the ability to embrace the miraculous, right? And so he's got one after another story from his own life where he's going along with friends or people, or sometimes even disciples of his, or things like that, depending on what point in his life he is. And where there's some terrible problem that happens, and his friends are all despairing, and he is, he was a devotee, right, of the Hindu version of God, let's put it, right? And so he is, he's continuing to trust. He says, no, let's just keep going. Let's, and then they're like, well, we're out of money, or, we're going to get caught, or whatever, all these different problems, right? They all think they're doomed. He goes, let's just keep going and trust. Right? And they go and they do, and then something comes out of nowhere and resolves it for them, right? And then they're miraculously saved, right? And then they're all amazed and they're all happy and wonderful about it. And then 3 days later, something else happens and they all lose their faith again, right? And there's stories about this in every religious tradition, right? There's certainly stories about that in the Bible, right? The disciples are constantly seeing Jesus do miracles and then losing their faith, right? That is a fundamental part of human nature. And it's not really that they're losing their faith, it's that they fall backwards into the paradigm that they are raised in. And that paradigm says that you have to do not believe that things are just going to work out or something like that, right? So the fantastical is always diminished, right? So if you add that kind of element to it in a game to make it into in the context of a legendary game, then you can have big groups that are doing things, magical wars that are happening and all that outside of the common view, right? But then it is going to be a legendary game, right? You're stepping into the realm of legend, right? If you want to do an authentic conspiracy in a setting that is meant to be realistic, so to say, meant to be authentic, whether it's medieval authentic or modern authentic or something like that, you instead have to work really hard to explain how big is the conspiracy, how the hell are they keeping it quiet, right? And what is that conspiracy about? Is it an actual conspiracy, or is it a conspiracy of failed expectations, or is it a conspiracy that is of a political ideology that is pushing for something which causes certain consequences? Because again, like 90% of the conspiracies that we talk about that are not like, the ridiculous ones, right? But a lot of the things that are happening look at our modern world, right? There's a ton of conspiracies that are happening completely out in the open, right? There was no secret conspiracy of like the Council of Gays that were going to try to lead to the modern day trans movement, right? That was not something that happened because there was some shadowy cabal that led to that, right? There was, in fact, a political activist movement. And that political activist movement had an ideology. That ideology drove them in a certain way. That was then intersected by the ideology of the postmodernist Marxists, who then co-opted that ideology and shifted it into something slightly different. And that, in turn, led to what we have today with like the LGBTQ plus, alphabet movement, right? But that wasn't because there was some group, like there's some group of guys in black robes or pink robes or whatever that had some secret master plan to do this, right? It was in a way a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy in the way people tend to think of conspiracies, right? So that's what you need to like look at there, right? Let's see here. Looking at some comments of what I was just talking about. Xnard thinks Kimberly Cheadle wanted Donald Trump dead. Well, I'm sure there were a lot of them that wanted Donald Trump dead. The question is, are they going to be murdering Trump? Like, did they give an order to do that, right? Like, that's a very big gap between those two things, right? But if you have people around in the Secret Service that would kind of be happy if Trump wasn't president, and they're part of the administration that is managing it, or they're part of the team that is on the ground at the rally, and they're still there, they're doing their job, but they're not going to do their job the same way that someone that has been trained to be dedicated to the job itself and step outside of the level of their political partisanship would do that job, right? That's the difference. Mogavor says Occam's razor suggests it has to be deliberate negligence, but Occam's razor is actually a self-refuting tautology. I now lost my spot here. Oh, there it is. Xnard says your hypothesis sounds correct, Casimir. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Mog of War talks about DI hiring, and yeah, of course, DI hiring is affecting every aspect of government, and it's never affecting it good, right? It's never affecting it in the right way, right? Because the people that are being hired are for some reason other than meritocracy. The people being hired, or in some cases, the people being nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate, right? Mogavore says, dude, paradigm blindness is a real conspiracy state secret. Just look at the WF and the people's ignorance of the stupid things. Well, yes, that is an example of paradigm blindness, right? Because people have been told that, you know, there's these groups of experts that talk about deep, meaningful expert things, and we should trust the science and things like that, right? And so people engage in a paradigm blindness where you can show them until sometimes even if you show them the video of you will own nothing and you will be happy, you know, like if you show them that video or show them other things that like literally Klaus Schwab wrote, they will still wave it away, right? Because they just can't put it into their heads that there's a group of people that would want to make that world, right? And that those people are like the most respected people in by almost every Western government, right? And so that is an example of paradigm blindness, yes. Not Public asks, do you think as technology advances, people will value human life more? I am not sure. I don't think that is a guarantee one way or the other. I don't think it'll necessarily mean that people value human life less or more necessarily. It depends on how the technology is applied. So it's really not about technology. It's about culture. It's about the culture of the people making the technology. Offer Nave says, Pundit, do you ever watch Dave Smith? I don't think so. The name doesn't sound familiar to me. Steambub says, having a degree doesn't mean you're smart. My God, you're right about that, Steambub. The world is absolute. Speaking as someone who has multiple degrees, I can tell you that the world is full of people who have degrees and are the farthest thing from smart. But the problem is it does lead to people thinking they are a special expert class who know better for the world and for individuals who are not like them. They think they should be the ones to decide what those people should be allowed or not allowed to do because they imagine that they are the smart ones. They're really 98% of the college educated are actually just midwits who don't realize they're not actually particularly smart. It's frightening. All right, so do you guys have any other things you wanted to talk about or questions? Otherwise, I think we've done a good run here. Let me know in the live chat if there's anything else you want to mention, or if you want to throw me a super chat or something like that. Again, if you want to help out this my channel, you hit the like button, share this video anywhere you think people find it interesting after the live stream. And of course, check out my various products. Now like, the meatball is curled up in my lap. Invisible College, Baptism of Crier, Sword and Caravan, great setting book. Got Lion and Dragon here. And many more, of course. I'm not going to show them all to you. Mog of War, $2. All right, thank you very much, Mog of War. You know what? If I got another $1.50, then I'd be able to buy an issue of the Pundit Files. The Pundit Files, oh yeah, that's the other thing I want to tell you guys about. Speaking of legend, so the Pundit Files issue 17 just came out today. It's called The Merry Men and Sherwood. This is a supplement for Lion and Dragon, specifically for Dark Albion. What it is detailing the area of Sherwood in the time period of the Dark Albion setting, so during the War of the Roses. And in the process, in this book, what I talk about is the different legends of Robin Hood, and I apply those legends into the chronicle of the world of Dark Albion. So instead of them being like stories about Robin Hood, they are part of the history of the Dark Albion setting, you know. And so because there were many different versions of Robin Hood in the different time periods where the Robin Hood stories were written, the original ones. And we're not talking about Disney's Robin Hood or Kevin Costner Robin Hood. We're talking about the real Robin Hood, right? And some of them were a lot better than the others, as in better people and things like that, right? And then it also talks all about Sherwood Forest and its surroundings. And it talks about how to incorporate all this in your campaign, you know, because by the time of the War of the Roses in the Dark Albion setting, there are still merry men. There are still like bandit raiders living in the Sherwood and Barnesdale forests. But it's been a long time since anyone has taken on the mantle of the Robin Hood. And so potentially in a campaign, you could have your characters playing there and one of them becoming the new Robin Hood, which is actually what basically happened in my original Dark Albion campaign. This issue of the Pundit Files also has in it a map that is a map that was made by Dominic Crusade. So it is in the same style of I think it's really just an expansion of one of the maps in the original Dark Albion book. So it's got lots of cool stuff. It details all of the areas around the region of the Sherwood, everything. There's all kinds of story elements from and plot hooks, obviously, from the various Robin Hood stories. The whole thing is 15 pages, and as usual, you will be able to get it for just $3.50. If you can get someone to give you about $3.50, you can get the latest issue of just out today of the Pundit Files, the Merry Men and Sherwood. So you know, check that out, and that's a very good example of how I took the legend of Robin Hood, which you get all the detail of that kind of those legend parts in the text of the book, and then put it into the chronicle of Dark Albion, right? Of Dark Albion as a real life setting with real life people, right? So this is not the really heroic, archetypal almost Robin Hood of modern day. This is a grittier version of Robin Hood. Xnard says, if you do an update or revisit your 3-year-old video of RPG Pundit's tips for making a living writing RPGs someday, that would be neat. Well, I'll have to look to see if there's much more I can suggest than what I did in that video. I have to watch it again to remember what I said. Steambub says, how to use invisible college magic in low fantasy? I guess it depends on what you're calling low fantasy there. Like, Lion and Dragon and Baptism of Fire are, from my point of view, low fantasy. And to me, one of the elements of low fantasy regarding magic is that magic takes time and complicated ingredients to use. And that's true in Lion and Dragon and in Baptism of Fire. And it's true for the most part in the Invisible College. Though I wouldn't really transfer the Invisible College, there are some techniques in Invisible College that are also in Lion and Dragon, or in Baptism of Fire, but they are slightly different. You'll notice that the version of them for the modern era is slightly different than the medieval version. And what I would do is I would shift it back towards something closer to the medieval version. Like if you're doing Kabbalistic invocations and stuff, you're going to need to make the magical circle and have the different ingredients of incenses and oils and all of that stuff that most modern magicians don't really do. My son is my nephew says, how many fedoras do you own? 0. I have absolutely no fedoras. I think they're stupid. So the Unicorn goes, so kind of like Robin of Sherwood. Yeah, like there was 2 seasons, I think, and they had to change Robin Hood, and one of them died, another guy became Robin. And that's essentially because there are at least 4 different like Robin Hood legends, right? They're very clearly different. And so in the history section of this Pundit Pundit Files issue, I treat them as if they were 4 separate Robin Hoods, because their stories take place in 4 different periods, right, over the course of like, well, close to 100 years, you know. Surly, we're just about to end the stream, I think. Can you give me the elevator pitch for Wilderlands? Okay, so Wilderlands, which I have here, Random Wilderness Encounters for Sword and Caravan. It's a very small book and therefore not very expensive, even if you get it in print. So you can also just get it on PDF. And I can get you right through it here, right? It starts with, at the very beginning, it has something that people shouldn't ignore. Page number 1, right? It talks here, example of procedures for daily travel. So you'll know that in Sword and Caravan, I have a whole bunch of different random tables, random road encounters, caravanserais, city encounters, unwanted attention, the different random tables at the end, like random aristocrats, mercenaries, merchant houses, etc., random villages, random settlement events, you know, all of that sort of stuff, right? And so here in page 1, I give you a checklist of, if you want to DM this as a pure sandbox, this is what you do, right? If you're on the road in the Silk Road region, you check for daily road encounter. Right. If you're on the road, you check for a caravanserai and you determine things from the random caravanserai tables. If you get to a city, you will check to see the city events, and then you will check for unwanted attention if you stay in the city long enough, and you will check for the different city groups that could be in there as desired. Likewise, if you're at a village, you roll for the random village table. Then you check for the next nearest settlement for its events, so you'll know what's going on ahead of time. And then if you're off-road, you use the Wilderland encounter tables, and you check for random ruins, random tribesmen for additional adventure seeds. So a DM following this kind of checklist can basically run, and I do, believe me, basically they can run Sword and Caravan without pre-planning anything. They just have to be on the ball of interpreting the results, right? So the next thing after that you get are Wilderland encounter tables by region. So this is not the encounter rolls you would do while you're traveling on the road, but it's like what happens if, and inevitably your characters will want to, if they leave the road and go into the mountains or into the desert or into the highlands or whatever, so these are just basically the monster tables for specific areas. After that, you get the stats for the Eastern Dragon, which were not in the main book. That's, the Chinese style dragon. And then you get some tables for some of the things you might encounter in the pure Wilderland, like random objects, random people, random ruins and tribesmen. And then you get also something else that wasn't in the main book, which is family generation rules for native characters. Because sooner or later, you're going to not play a Crusader. Somebody's going to die, and then they're going to make a character that's from, Hamadan or, Nishapur. And so then you've got the modified rules for social class, for family, siblings, details about how family inheritance works in Muslim and Chinese cultures. And then you get an optional family secrets table and optional inheritance tables of something that your character may have received if he is one of the sons of some guy who's died. That will be a special object for you. Right? And so that's basically what's in the book. Right? You don't absolutely have to have it to run Sword and Caravan, just like you don't have to have Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road or Social Encounters. But all 3 of them do certainly add something. And while Heroes and Villains adds NPCs mostly, Social Encounters gives you mechanics for making complex social interactions. But Wilderlands adds how you would adjudicate stuff. First of all, it tells you how to adjudicate stuff in general, and also how you would adjudicate stuff specifically when the characters decide to go off-road. Magavore says increments can't send tree pity. That's all right. So that's the elevator pitch for Wilderland. I hope that's enough for you, Goldworm. I think the book is worth it. At the very least, it's worth you getting it in PDF. In fact, originally it was going to be a PDF only product. It's probably the shortest printed book I've ever had. It's only 20 pages long, right? But there were some people that really wanted to get it in book form. So Chris Miller decided to put it out as in print. It was originally it was just going to be PDF only. All right. Anything else you guys want to talk about before we finish up? Nobody. All right. Well, I guess we're gonna close out here. I've been doing this for 2.5 hours, so that's not too bad at all. Thank you to everybody who watched. And I don't have any specific day of the week that I do live streams. So you just have to keep watching for when I decide to do it. As I thought this topic would have been too long to do as a regular video, and I'm glad I did it as a live stream, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Yeah, we'll see you all soon. Spread the word, share the video, and don't forget to check out my games and all the other great OSR products that are out there. They're definitely a better choice than most of the alternatives these days. Okay, currently smoking. This is a Stanwell. No, sorry, it's a Lorenzetti oversized Hawkbill plus Argento Natural. Good night.